Way down under, on Mornington Peninsula, and about an hour's drive from Melbourne, Australia, one of my favorite places in the world, lives Dr. Roger Stuart-Andrews. Roger is a retired dentist and an avid historian. He has a fascinating proposition for us, something we have to look at with an open mind. Did Fletcher Christian depart Pitcairn and secretly return to England to live out his days? Remember, I said have an open mind, as Dr. Stuart-Andrews recommends you do. I can't wait to hear this. And when you are in Victoria State in Australia, do stop by Hannah and Roger's B&B. There is a printout for you. If you don't have it, Ted has extra copies and he'll be happy to hand it to you. It has been emailed to those of you whose email addresses we had. Okay? Roger, come and tell us all about this fascinating proposition.
Thank you, Barbara. There we are. Okay. This talk is a brief summary of 13 years part-time researching diaries in Cumbria and chasing relatives of deceased authors, all in the search of a wraith in an attempt to solve a mystery. First, I need to convince you that there is a mystery to solve. The presentation is purely factual in nature. The interpretation will be yours. I'm going to ask a lot of questions as I go through. You have to provide the answers for yourself. I am not. The ultimate fate of Fletcher Christian. Let us look at the evidence. The interest in this topic in the modern era began in 1963 when Wilkinson published a book called The Wake of the Bounty, which had been stimulated by his purchase of a scrapbook in a bookshop in London. Wilkinson collected Victorian scrapbooks with a typographical flavour, and browsing through one in a bookshop, he was surprised to see a very plain letter, a boring letter about some plans, dated 1812, but it was signed with a beautiful flourish, F. Christian. This aroused his interest, and he bought the book to compare the signature with others of Fletcher's. But he was amazed and disappointed to find at that time there were none. However, he then began to trawl records looking for other evidence, some of which we will meet shortly. We'll return to Cuthbert Selby Wilkinson and the scrapbook at the end of this talk. So let's look at the evidence for the ultimate fate of Fletcher Christian. Given the paucity of any hard evidence surrounding the cause of the demise of the leader of the mutineers, there seems to me to be as much evidence for his body to lie here as it is to lie there. First, I shall present the facts originating from Pitcairn's Island. Only two eyewitnesses are recorded: John Adams, whose recounting varies with each telling, and Jenny, whose recountings do at least remain consistent, although interpreted, which means that they're second-hand. These two leave us with the following ends for their leader. Jenny told the Sydney Gazette in 1819 that 4 black men still, as she put it, studied revenge and shot Christian. She later gave a further report to the Reverend Henry Knott, who published it in both 1826 and 1829, saying, and I quote, "The natives next proceeded to shoot Christian. They found him clearing some ground for a garden, and while in the act of carrying away some roots, they went behind him and shot him between the shoulders. He fell. They then disfigured him with an axe about the head and left him dead on the ground." Adams' explanations of the death of the man he forever called Mr. Christian varied with each visitor. No fewer than 4 differing reports reached the Admiralty after Topaz visited. First, Christian and all the English were killed on one night about 4 years after their arrival. Second, Christian became insane soon after arrival and threw himself off the rocks into the sea. Then the massacre of the remaining 6 took place. Third, Fletcher died about 6 years after they landed, when all the English except Adams were killed. Finally, they lived under Christians' government several years after they landed, enjoying tolerable harmony, and Christian became sick and died a natural death. And it was after this that the Otahitian men killed the remaining English. This report was amazingly ignored by the Admiralty, so that the next visitors, Tagus and Britain, thought that they were the discoverers of the Bounty mutineers. Staines of Britain reported that the elder Christian fell a sacrifice to the jealousy of an Otahitian man within 3 or 4 years of their arrival on the island, and that Christian was as bad a despot as Bligh, and so disgusted his countrymen and the Otahitians that when his Tahitian wife died within a 12-month from their landing, he carried off another man's wife, and this man then shot him dead while digging in his own field. Pippin of Tagus, same visit, published an account which blackened Christian's character and had him shot by a black man whilst digging in his field, and almost instantaneously expired. This happened about 11 months after they were settled on the island. Rain of Surrey in 1821 reports that Christian killed some of the Tahitians who then killed him. This is the only mention of this, and of course is wrong. Peard of Blossom records the following. Several years after their arrival, Christian was working his plantation at the bottom of the valley when Menali or Minari shot him through the back. Christian exclaimed, "Oh dear," and fell. This groan was heard by Mills and McCoy, the latter saying that someone was dying, but the former claiming it was only Christian's wife calling the children for dinner. His captain, Beechey, is told on the same visit, 2 years after their arrival on the island, 4 of the Tahitians proceeded to Christian, who was working at his yam plot, and shot him. An unmarked grave was shown to Beechey in 1825, Waldegrave in 1830, and Bennett in 1834. These accounts are fine, but one cannot help but wonder why only one of these graves survives today. Surely most communities would be more likely to preserve the grave of their leader and founder than simply that of the last survivor. So, in summary, then, Fletcher was killed variously from 6 or 8 months, 11 months, about 4 years, and about 6 years after the landing. He became insane and jumped into the sea. He was shot in the back with and without being bludgeoned by an axe, or he died a natural death. Plenty of choice there. His character is seemingly as ambiguous as his end. He was sullen and morose. He was sullen and morose. He was always cheerful. He was sexually indulgent. He was the height of probity. He treated men capriciously and brutally. He was caring about the welfare of his men. He is reported to have begun the bloodbath by taking a Tahitian's wife after the death of his own. Yet Jenny states that Isabella, or mainmast, was alive and well when she, Jenny, left Pitcairn in 1829. Confusion obviously reigned on the island. Meanwhile, back in dear old Blighty, rumours about Fletcher's return to England had been current since soon after the mutiny. They began with the 1796 publication of this book with the purported letters from Fletcher Christian. These letters exonerated Bligh and put all the blame on Christian. Extracts from them appeared in a paper called The Weekly Entertainer in September 1796. Their publication also allowed for an intriguing piece of evidence for Fletcher's return by the vehement denunciation of this book as a fraud by a family friend, William Wordsworth. The Weekly Entertainer was published at Sherborne, and Wordsworth contributed the following letter. Mutiny on board the Bounty to the printer, Racedown Lodge, October 23rd, 1796. Sir, there having appeared in your Entertainer an extract from a work purporting to be the production of Fletcher Christian, who headed the mutiny on board the Bounty, I think it proper to inform you that I have the best authority for saying that the publication is spurious. Your regard for truth will induce you to apprise your readers of this circumstance. I am, sir, your humble servant, William Wordsworth. This is the only letter Wordsworth wrote under his own name to the press in his 80 years of life. Why would he feel so compelled to use his own name and to state so unequivocally his beliefs unless he had powerful reasons for doing so? Towards the end of his long life, he again takes up his pen and wrote a text in 1841 for a volume of etchings called Guide to the Lakes, which ran as follows. So much was this region considered out of the way until a late period that persons who had fled from justice used often to resort thither for concealment. And some were so bold as not infrequently to make excursions from the place of their retreat for the purpose of committing fresh offences. Another little piece of the jigsaw, or just a coincidence? Meantime, James Losh, lawyer friend of the Christian family and of the Lake poets, noted in his diary on April the 3rd, 1798, "I explained the real state of Christians' mutiny to Southey and Barry, who both seemed much struck by it." To what real state was he referring? In 1797, a volume of poetry called Lyrical Ballads, containing two works, The Borderers by William Wordsworth and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Each work can be read as potentially telling the story of the voyage of the Bounty and the disaster that befell her, plus the post-mutiny events 11 years before the discovery of the community on Pitcairn. Both were friends of the Christian family, with Wordsworth having extremely close ties and an obligation to them. I see similarities that I claim lie between the events portrayed in these poems and the events as they were told to the world some years later. The poem 1790, these are examples. The poem 1797 Mariner has wild mood swings. Pippin informed the world of Fletcher's after interviewing Adams in 1814. The poem's 1797 protagonist is depressed and considers suicide. Beechey and Peard interviewed Adams in 1825 and heard of Fletcher approaching Matthew Quintal to join him in the mutiny and opening his jacket to show a deep-sea lead concealed in his breast to show that he had a fallback plan should his mutiny fail. Both this mariner and the author of the fraudulent book had their hero return to his home in Britain, while out in mid-Pacific we learn much later that Fletcher read the story of the prodigal son from the Bounty's Bible more frequently than any other story. Coleridge headed the first printing of his work with what he called an argument, which effectively traces Bounty's route. How a ship having passed the line was driven by storms to the cold country towards the South Pole, and how from thence she made her course to the tropical latitude of the great Pacific Ocean, and of the strange things that befell, and in what manner the ancient mariner came back to his own country. Both the letters and the poem have him return home. The Borderers is a 5-act tragedy by Wordsworth, composed between the latter part of 1795 and during the course of 1796, but not published until 1841, after much revision, which changed the entire focus of the original play. This work tells the story of a tormented young man who rises against a tyrant and maroons him on an island, highlighting that a good man knows when he is doing wrong and torments himself for it more than any punishment could possibly inflict. Wordsworth postulates a character who can picture a society where his crimes would no longer be seen as crimes, and he would enjoy the estimation to which he deems himself entitled. Could this be the community he founded on a misplaced island in the middle of the world's largest ocean? The marooned captain has an imperious temper and is hated by all the men. The lines here echo the expulsion of Bligh in the longboat, a man by men deserted, who was standing, stretching forth his arms, while his crew scoffed at him with hellish mockery. In the rewritten play, Wordsworth's lines bring to me a vision of a 24-year-old man as he departs Tahiti to vanish for 18 years. I shall go forth a wanderer on the earth, a shadowy thing, and as I wander on, no human ear shall ever hear my voice, no human dwelling ever give me food or sleep or rest. Finally, Wordsworth has his hero use the words, "I am in hell," thus echoing Fletcher's well-recorded response to Bligh's, "Is this a proper return for the many instances you have received of my friendship?" And the reply from Fletcher was, "That, Captain Bligh, that is the thing. I am in hell. I am in hell." Why did Wordsworth wait 44 years before publishing? Was there a reason not to stir the hornet's nest in the 1790s, which was not a problem in the 1840s? The reason we know so much about the changes is that Wordsworth kept notebooks detailing drafts and corrections of all his works. But this notebook, alone of all the surviving Wordsworth notebooks, has only 32 leaves, having had an original total of 124. The last 2/3 of the book have been cut out. Why? This time of revision is when I place the prodigal's likely return, and when Losh is in Bristol as a lawyer and potential first port of call, given that Bristol was the main port for ships from Spain and South America. It is also around the time we have records of Wordsworth hiring a cottage for a period of several months, but no record of his ever using it for himself. Who did use it? Wordsworth was in straitened circumstances at this time, so why seemingly waste money? Then we have the sightings of Fletcher in England. Peter Hayward, close friend, fellow midshipman, reports seeing a man with Fletcher's exaggerated bow-legged stride in Fore Street, Plymouth Dock in 1809. He hastened after him, and the man turned and glanced over his shoulder, a face similar to Fletcher's, with a look of fear, and then ran up a side street and disappeared. For the rest of his life, Hayward always swore that was Fletcher. He would not have been running from Hayward, but he would have been running from the noose which awaited him, because he knew, if it was Fletcher, he knew that 3 of the men he led that day had already been hanged. Independently, at the same time as this report, Sir John Barrow, Permanent Secretary to the Admiralty, reports a general opinion in 1808-9 that Christian was in that part of the country making private visits to an aunt living there. But more importantly, he personally vouches for the truth of this story. Why? He had access to Peter Hayward's papers via Lady Belcher, his stepdaughter, plus Hayward was in direct contact with the Christian family at the time. Did Barrow also know more than he was admitting to? In the 1870s, William Fletcher, a distant cousin, wrote, "Many tales were rife 60 or 70 years ago of his having been met and recognised in the woods and bypaths of this neighbourhood, but by those who had too much sympathy for him and his family to betray his secret. It is also said that his first cousin, John Christian Kirwan, MP, used his great influence to prevent any official search being made for the fugitive," unquote. A third eminent man of letters, Robert Southey, was a contemporary and friend of Losh, friend and fellow poet laureate of Wordsworth, and friend of Coleridge and the Christian family, who leaves us some interesting diary entries, which were never intended for publication. He had a warm relationship with his brother, an officer in the Royal Navy. A year after the sighting in Fore Street, Southey wrote to a close friend regarding these rumours in 2 letters written 1 week apart. But here again, why were they not published with all his other correspondence in the mid-19th century after Southey died? They appeared only in 1965. Interesting, suspicious, I don't know, another piece of the jigsaw. The contents of a third letter in 1807 from Southey yet again only hint at what could be told about certain events, when he mentions an old, just retired captain as having been at sea for 40 years and now retired to the Isle of Man, and that, and quote, "there would have been no mutiny on board his ship. Boy captains are the persons who make mutinies. Oh, Grosvenor Bedford, the guy's name, what a pamphlet would I write about the Navy if my brother were not in it," unquote. Is it too far-fetched to see the link in his mind between the Isle of Man, home of the Christian and Bligh families, and the 34-year-old Bligh losing his ship? Yes. Back to Southey's 2 letters to his friend Grosvenor Bedford. The first letter is dated October 23rd, 1809. "I called Captain Bligh notorious as the only way in which I could imply that he was a thorough rascal. It was an act of much self-control not to accompany the sentence with a bitter sarcasm, saying the missionaries had a lucky escape, for his unendurable tyranny might have driven more Christians to desperation. I know a great deal of that affair of the bounty from James Losh, who with Professor Christian, poor Fletcher C.'s brother, went to the mutineers that were brought home and collected their testimony concerning all the circumstances which led to it. I know too, or rather have every reason to believe, that Fletcher C. was within these few years in England and at his father's house, an interesting circumstance in such a history, and one which I hardly ought to mention, so do not let it get abroad. For though the Admiralty would be very sorry to hang him, some rascal or other would gladly apprehend him for the price of blood, and hung of course he would be. But if every man had his due, Bligh would have had the halter instead of the poor fellows whom we brought from Tahiti. His second letter is dated a week later, October 30th, 1809, again to Grosvenor, Bedford. My dear Grosvenor, I will tell you all I know concerning poor F.C., and you may use your own discretion about Henry, in whose discretion I have full confidence. F. is a native of this country, one of our country gentlemen, a very remarkable and strong-headed man, who was his schoolfellow and knows his person as well as you know mine, told me that about 5 or 6 years ago, as he was walking near his own house with his daughter, he saw 2 gentlemen riding towards him, and recognised one of them time enough to say to his daughter, "Look at this man, it is F.C., and also to consider that it would be better not to speak to him, which he was on the point of doing. There was a dog with the horseman, and presently afterwards some boys came along who had picked up a collar bearing the name of F.C.'s father. My friend had no doubt before of his identity, and this was a confirmation of the fact. What has become of him since, God knows, but I should think it likely from his own character and that of his family that one of these days the whole history will come to light." That was that one. These letters support the comments of Barrow in his book in 1831. He states a general opinion that Christian was in that part of the country around the lakes of Cumberland and Westmoreland making private visits to an aunt there. But again, he goes one step further than I would expect when he personally vouches, and these are quotes, personally vouches for the truth of the story. Unquote. Why be so emphatic? What did he know that he's not letting on? In summary, we have 3 men of impeccable credentials, with much to lose and nothing to gain, by speaking out forcefully and publicly on an emotive issue. 2 poets laureate and the permanent secretary to the Admiralty, each effectively telling us that they know more than they can say. Why be so vehement unless they were protecting a reputation? But how could they be so sure? What did they know? Add to this that Young's diary, as far as we know from the reports of what was in it, because we haven't seen the original, makes no mention of the death of the community's leader, or the reason for the disappearance of the only boat on the island. Plus, we have the mystery of the missing coins with which Bounty sailed, and which have never been found. In the wreck, on the island, there's no record of what happened to them. But how sea travel in those days was expensive. If someone left, they might need the passage for a fare. So the Christian family were all educated, and many were legally trained. So most left wills in the expected manner, but not Fletcher's mother or brother. Why did they, alone of their whole extended family, leave no wills? Because their goods would be at the disposal of surviving family members and not subject to legal scrutiny. Yet another coincidence, or another piece in the jigsaw of a life? Add to all this that Young's diary makes no mention of the death of the community's leader. Oh, sorry, I've done that already. It's also interesting that Edward Christian's initial pamphlet condemning Bligh was replied to by Bligh's retort. But Edward chose not to continue his attack on Bligh and further promote his brother's cause. Why? Would further publicity have inflamed the situation? And would these flames have illuminated more than the Christian camp would have wished to have exposed at this time? Now we return to Wilkinson and his visit to a London bookshop. With handwriting experts' evidence admissible in some courts now with their added sophistication, and with the discovery of 3 extant signatures of Fletcher, each with an impeccable provenance, with which to compare the 1812 signature in the scrapbook would be a valuable find. And one of my aims is to go to London, and I've tracked down Wilkinson's relatives, and I shall be looking for that scrapbook. Finally, why is the scrapbook so important? And this is where we complete our circle. Finally, that should be that slide, sorry. Finally, Wilkinson traced the scrapbook to the last descendant of no other than James Losh, whom we met earlier, and this link completes our circle. Losh's library was broken up after his death in 1834, and it was reported that certain private papers had been retained by the family. I am assuming that this is the provenance of the scrapbook. So a definitive solution to this mystery can only be found on the island. Currently, the desire is not there, but I'm preparing a paper to detail how and where I would endeavour to find him and the benefits of so doing. When this will occur, if ever, is quite properly in the hands of the Pitcairners themselves. Meantime, we can but speculate, as I've done today, hopefully leaving you something to ponder on. Thank you.